It's almost like a museum, yes. And it took many years to kind of accumulate all of these instruments. Every time I would do a project and I would think of a specific repertoire, so I would actually go buy the instrument. This saz, I owned it from a long time ago, but because it's of a particular size, and for a project, if I needed a longer size, so I would have to go buy it. You know, went to Turkey, and so that's how I ended up accumulating a lot of this.
Today we're going to dive more deep into the realm of all different kinds of colorful music and the music that we may not even heard of. Okay. And thanks to you that we can see from your perspective and through your guidance, we can see all those possibilities of the creations. So you won the Grammy nominations from your song, which is called A Gentleman of Istanbul. Do you want to talk a bit about it?
Of course. First of all, thank you so much for including me as part of your series. A Gentleman of Istanbul was commissioned by a well-known string orchestra, a Far Cry string orchestra based in Boston. And they reached out to me, I think it was in 2018. But that's because I actually worked with them before, and that was back in 2012, I think. That too, because that project too was nominated for a Grammy. I contributed to that project, which was entitled Dreams and Prayers. I contributed to it with one composition. When they reached out to me in 2018, that was for a longer, extended piece. So Gentleman of Istanbul is like 35 minutes. It's in 4 movements, and I think we premiered it in 2019. But we were getting ready to record it, at which time COVID hit, so we got delayed, and then we still recorded it. I think in 2022, once we released that album, which was basically just A Gentleman of Istanbul. So it was an album of just my music. So that's why, when the album was nominated for a Grammy, it was a much bigger event for me.
How was the feeling when you first heard about this news?
Well, okay, that's funny because when you run for Grammys, you have your album and you typically submit it in more than one category, okay? And so I submitted it under, I think, 3 categories. And A Far Cry, they submitted it in 3 other categories, but I didn't remember which ones they submitted. Okay, and so I remember I was going to go teach at NEC, right after the announcement, but I mean immediately after. So I sit down right over here in this room in front of my computer, and I'm like, okay, I'm waiting. When it was announced that it was nominated for Best Classical Production, I wasn't expecting it because I forgot that they submitted it for that category. So it was funny because I was kind of dumbfounded. Like, I didn't expect Sanlıkol, that Gentleman of Istanbul. And it's like, huh? So it was a surprise.
Oh wow, that was a fun moment. This is not your first time collaborating with Far Cry. Far Cry is a very interesting chamber orchestra. Yeah. So would you actually conduct?
No, the way it worked with them both times when I collaborated with them. I mean, first of all, they're world-class players, so there's that. Second, obviously, they work with no conductor. It's a conductorless orchestra. So I would go to the rehearsals, even if I didn't play. In this piece, as you may remember, I'm a soloist. I play in all the movements. But even when, in our prior collaboration, when I didn't play, it would be like I would sit and listen, and then they would stop and ask, for feedback. And so when I provided feedback, I often sing, parts of the melodies that I may have written, and or give them an indication of time, tempo, but never conduct. Never. And they have it. Once I give them the tempo, the whoever is the concertmaster, the leading violinist or whatever, they just go, boom, that's it.
Yeah, I saw the videos.
Yeah, it's amazing. That's it. That's all they need, and they make it work. And so, I mean, frankly, coming also from a jazz world, that makes sense.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
yeah.
So this is a symphony of strings, pianos, oud, ney, and tenor.
Yes.
Wow, this is so colorful. And for those, I mean, they are great musicians, but this is maybe not in their realm of
Not
knowledge
really, yeah.
awareness. So how do you communicate those nuances?
So first of all, when they asked me, when they came to me with a commission, I asked, do you have a theme in mind? And they said, no, we want you to compose whatever you feel like. So because they gave me such freedom, I thought, okay, let me think about a theme that is really dear to my heart. And at the time, there was a lot of stereotypes in people's minds about Islam or people from Turkey, the Middle East. I mean, there still are a lot of stereotypes, but at the time, it was important for me. And so I thought, if I compose a piece that is very colorful, with jazz, with classical music, with film music, every different kind of aspect, I thought that that would make a huge impact. So that's why I said to myself, okay, I'm gonna put piano in the, like second movement is like a jazz ballad. So I have piano. The first movement has oud. Third movement has the ney, and in the last movement I sing. In every movement, I have a little bit of the instrument that's going to come up in the next. So even though the first movement is dominated by the oud, there's a section where you hear the piano. And then in the next movement, the piano is the main instrument, and then you hear a little bit of the ney, etc. And so, this was the idea. It's a risky move because you want your composition to be coherent. So it's very risky to make such huge changes, mood changes, style changes between movements. But I thought that I could handle it. And I thought that if I choose a form that's very traditional, that's going to help too. So it really is a symphony, and it's very classical. It's 4 movements. And if you think about it, the first movement is, fast movement, second movement, slow movement, third movement, in 3 time, or in this case it's 6, but 3, 6, there. And then fourth movement begins slow, but then, speeds up. It actually follows the classical symphony model very much. Communicating the nuances wasn't that difficult. They're so good, and they're so open-minded that, I mean, maybe the only time I had to explain, some of the nuances, it was more about, like the third movement is very minimal, like a minimalist kind of approach. Like I explained, why I went for that kind of mood and compositional approach, but it wasn't difficult in terms of trying to get them to follow the jazz aesthetic or the Turkish music aesthetic. They're so open-minded and so good. It was very quick.
Oh wow! I think those are where the musicians and also as composers you're really happy about is that you can work with other.
Yeah, a far cry is wonderful.
Yeah. But with all of your abundant knowledge and very fundamental knowledge that root a lot in classical music, then we need to talk a bit about your early childhood memory.
Sure.
So, which you were born in Istanbul. This is a beautiful city, and I know there is 2 different sides. There's an Asian side and an European side. Yeah. But I guess you're in the European side.
Yeah. I was born in the European side.
Yeah. And your parents were coming from Cyprus. So. And you studied with your mother with your classical music.
Yeah, because my mother grew up in Cyprus. At the time, Cyprus was part of the United Kingdom. Even though her teachers were Turkish Cypriots, but there would be a lot of British teachers or examiners that would come every year from the royal schools, the Royal Academy. And so they would hold examinations every year back in the 50s. And so my mom took, those examinations, etc., directly from the examiners that would come from from London, basically. And so then they moved to Turkey, and I was born in Istanbul. But then I grew up in a smaller city called Bursa, very close to Istanbul. And in that city, there weren't any classical piano teachers. And so my mom was really kind of, at least at that time, like she was the first, only person. So our house grew up classical, Schultzes and all that. And so that was part of my childhood. Yeah. I remember playing like, Mozart Major Sonata part when I was 10. Couldn't do it now. Couldn't play it by heart.
And as we moved to the United States, started at Berkeley. Back then, Berkeley's a thing, isn't it?
Berkeley was a jazz school. It's no longer just a jazz school. Jazz is now visible in it's more a contemporary music school. I went there 93 to 90. In those years, it really was mainly a jazz. I also film too. I did degrees there in film, but the main focus really ended up being jazz, and then I went to NEC, and there I was lucky enough to study Russell and Bob Brookman, and they were still at NEC. Then on the classical composition side, I worked with Lee, and he's a great composer.
A performance is called Domya. You use the Moog synthesizer. Yeah. Do you like it?
Yes. Actually, I own two Moog synthesizers. They're at the repair shop right now. They're being cleaned. Yeah, they're not here. But I own a Moog Prodigy and a Moog Realistic.
What's the difference?
Oh, I mean, they're just different. Like many analog synthesizers, they have their different colors. They're like having two guitars. If they're acoustic instruments, especially, they're never the same. Even if the same maker, right? So analog keyboards are a bit like that. They have their individualistic feels. So the Prodigy is a different keyboard. The Realistic is different. But yes, I mean, I still very much love analog synthesizers. I love the Fender Rhodes electric piano. I love the Hohner clavinet. These 70s sounds. I love them. I still use them. In my albums, even recent albums, I still actually use these instruments.
Seeing this very little size keyboard, but amazing sounds, and it also takes the whole performance into another boiled and experimental level.
It's obviously because the big band or the jazz orchestra. I mean, it's sound. Everyone has kind of a when you say big band to someone, they think of a particular timbre, a particular sound. Sure, you can be a unique composer and write in very different ways, which I like to think I do. But bringing into that world unique instruments like the Moog, or some of the instruments that I play, like Turkish instruments, suddenly, obviously, adds a different kind of richness.
That's incredible. So I know after graduating, you actually toured a little bit.
I did,
you were a jazz band. But why did it stop?
Well, it was because when I was beginning my doctorate studies at NEC, and it's right then is when I also reconnected with my roots, and I suddenly started playing and studying Turkish music. Even though I grew up in Turkey, I was always surrounded with Western music, not Turkish music. And because we were so idealizing Western culture in my home or in my friend circle, we kind of looked down on our own culture growing up. And so I neglected that richness for a long time.
So even though it's there, but you close your heart to it.
Yeah, my heart, my eyes, everything. It's really not my fault. It's that was that is still the case. In Turkey, and in other parts of the world. Exactly. Lots of people have this divide. They idealize Western, many aspects of Western culture, and they turn their backs on their own culture. Or sometimes it's the opposite. Like they they put up a fight against Western culture, and they go completely, heavily ideological on their own culture. So I think neither one is good. It'd be nice if there was a balance. And so the balance, is about appreciating all cultures for what they are. And so when I started studying Turkish music, first of all, it was huge. I mean, all of these instruments that you see, they came into my life. I was a student all over again, of an entirely new, because it doesn't matter that, you were born in Turkey.
No.
It doesn't matter that you heard those sounds. Sure, you may remember a song or two, but to study an art music from your own country is still, requires finding masters and learning, certain aspects, tuning, etc.
Did you feel like less confident actually to study your music but in Western country?
Well, not really. You know why? Because, for example, when I came to Berkeley in '93, I felt that learning jazz was like learning a new language. Like, for example, I remember trying to play bebop, and it took a while. Like, I remember it took a couple of months until I started kind of being able to play a little bit of bebop. With Turkish music, it was more like I knew the language, I didn't know the grammar. It was something like that. But also, I don't believe I was speaking the language well. It was like, oh, this sounds familiar, Whereas in jazz, it was like it was new. Only things that were familiar in jazz were like 70s funk. Those were familiar because I kind of, I was born in mid 70s, and so that wasn't too far back. I heard some of those sounds, so those were quicker for me to feel.
So I guess Turkish music is more able to internalize with your body and mind.
I mean, I internalized, I think, Western classical music first. And then I think I internalized jazz because I studied it and played it and toured like for, at least 7-8 years, and then Turkish music, was faster. I was already playing concerts like 3-4 years, into it. It didn't stop me from continuing to study. So like that period where I didn't tour as much, release jazz records was like 10 years. My second jazz album, I released it in like 2003. And then until 2014, like 10 years, 11 years after, I released another jazz album. So there was a big gap. If you look at that gap, I released so many different albums, but they were almost always Turkish music.
Yeah. So I remember that you first composed a major commission work in 2002. And then 9 years later, you got another commission by American Islamic Congress.
So long gap.
Are there different layers that push you to realize even more with your mood?
In that period, between 2002 and like 2012, the Far Cry Commission actually came in like 2011. So, and then there was also one small commission in between too, and so there were a couple things, and I actually didn't stop composing entirely, but I wasn't. I was too much busy with learning traditional music, so I wasn't like chasing after a career. Which is not a good thing for young musicians. But then, from a different perspective, I learned Turkish music well. I internalized it so that when I came back to my career, I had a new voice, a voice that was richer, and it had, more musical languages, Sometimes I look back and, those were like many other younger composers or performers, you spend your 30s chasing after your career, whereas in my case, I was learning a new tradition, so it was kind of strange, from a career perspective.
I felt that no matter how great, successful one person is, we always regret something that we didn't do.
I look back and it's like, it's not a regret so much because had I not studied Turkish music, then I really wouldn't have all of this richness in my music.
Looking back, did you feel there's any dark moment in your career, especially in the jazz band? Because I know nowadays even the jazz musicians are so hard to survive just with tours.
Yeah. I think, in fact, maybe Turkish music was a savior. Because yes, I gotten a big commission in 2002, and which was basically a classical commission. At the time, my jazz band was having a very hard time touring. It was so hard to get gigs or travel to festivals. They didn't have enough money. We were not big enough as a band. We were not famous enough, so they wouldn't pay all of our travel fare. So we would always have to find more festivals to combine, and we would barely make profits. I couldn't see it grow, it was bleak. And so yes, there was a period right then when I started feeling a little hopeless. But then, funny, Turkish music came into my life, and completely by accident, And so that was a good thing. That being said, I'm sure that if I, continued on the jazz path, maybe things would have happened too. Who knows? But one thing for sure, it would not have been what it is now. Like, I play so many different instruments, and they all find their way into my music.